This is WION World at One, and this is a special edition. Today we're delighted to be joined by Madhusudan and Rajeev Mantri. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. We're discussing your fantastic new book, Individual Rights in a Civilizational State, a New Idea of India. So the 19th of November was a very special day, and you woke up and sometime during the day you saw a tweet from Prime Minister Modi. How did that feel?
Well, it was a great feeling. Obviously, the book is about policy, politics and governance, and to have the leader of the free world, one of the leaders of the free world, and the Prime Minister of India acknowledge and recognize the book was very special.
Yeah, and how many retweets are on it now? How many likes have you had?
Well, I think there are around 4,000 to 5,000 retweets on that tweet, and about 25,000 or so likes.
That's fantastic. Now, first of all, let's start the show by just giving an introduction to the audience. Give us a little summary of the book. Tell us about what you're trying to achieve, where it all came from.
Sure. So I'll begin. Thank you so much, Jasper, for having us on. So the book, A New Idea of India, speaks about India as a civilizational republic. So that's the big idea. So India is one of the few major civilizations of the world that have existed and continued in its ancient form right to the modern time. And yet it's a constitutional democratic republic. And you know, the only other major single civilizational nation state in the world is China, but it's not a democratic republic. The West has many democratic republics, different nation states, under one Western civilization. So India is the unique example of one nation state also being a civilizational republic. And I think it is important to kind of reinforce that it's an ancient idea, but now modified and suited for modern times. And the reason we say a new idea of India is we say in consonance with Indian civilization, there will always be multiple views, and ours is just one view. Because the idea of India has been debated in India for many decades. There was a certain Nehruvian idea of India. There was a famous book by Sunil Khilnani called The Idea of India on the 50th anniversary of Indian independence, 1997, which set out the Nehruvian idea of India as the consensus of the nation. And we are trying to not necessarily challenge it, but debate it, discuss it, and to some extent challenge it.
Okay, so that's great. Just give us a sense of how you guys came together, what the genesis of the book was, where this all sort of came from.
Well, so Harsh and I have now known each other for about 11 years. We met first in 2009, and we've written about 50, 60 odd sort of columns and articles together. And we decided that doing a book, maybe combining many of the ideas in the columns as a kind of a bigger work, more accessible work than a set of columns would be better. And that's how it started in maybe 2 years ago now, I think, is when we got contacted by publishers and sort of we were able to get that together.
All the people who are in public policy, politics, economics in India, and many people in the diaspora, including non-Indians, seem to have acknowledged the book, debated it, discussed it. And you know, what more can any author really wish for?
And that's very much the intention, as I understand it, Harsh and Rajeev, is that it's a catalyst for debate as opposed to a set of personal ideologies or a prescription. Is that right?
Most certainly. I think that was the idea, to strike up debate on many of the issues confronting India, the policy issues, the political issues, and to that end I think the book has done very well.
Okay, so before we get into kind of unpacking the book and debating a few of the issues, I guess at the outset the idea of defining a country as old and as complex as India is a daunting task. Were you daunted even before you started?
To some extent, yes. Obviously, the book is very expansive in that sense. So we start all the way from, you know, the opening chapter of the book has a hymn from the Rig Veda, and then it goes on to all the issues confronting modern India. So we've drawn that expanse out, and we do feel that we've taken a good stab at it. But obviously, no work like this can ever be complete. We don't claim to have all the answers or even have addressed all the challenges in that sense.
And what would you want if you were just praising this for anybody? I mean, I would think Prime Minister Modi's read it cover to cover, but for those that haven't, what would you see as the kind of 2 or 3 most compelling, powerful, thoughtful messages in here, and then we can debate some of those and we can look at how people
I think a couple of the key messages are on, first of all, India as a civilization. It's not a country that was created in 1947 when India decolonized, the British left and Pakistan was created. That's one message. The other message is India should see all citizens as individual citizens and not as members of groups like religious, linguistic or caste groups. That's kind of the North Star that's guiding us. On economics, we argue for free markets with an exception on trade. It's an interesting nuance there. And then finally, we talk a lot about state capacity. Whether you want free speech or whether you want defense indigenization, you can abstractly discuss many things, but if your state does not have competence and capability, you can't implement much of it.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's take the opening gambit, which is around the idea of civilizational. Yes. In a kind of polemical way, I guess one could also argue that, what could be more obvious than India is, several thousand years old. Why does anyone need reminding of that? Isn't it an obvious thing that India is incredibly old and incredibly civilized?
No, actually, I think in recent decades, actually, that has become contested, as we write in the book. So the idea that India is a civilization was obvious to the leaders of the freedom movement. If you look at the cover of the book, actually, it's an illustration from the original Constitution of India. That's a image of Ramji, Sitaji and Lakshmanji from the fundamental rights section of the original Constitution that was illustrated by this Bengali painter, Nandlal Bose.
Yeah.
And at that time, obviously, the sort of leaders of the freedom movement, it seemed perfectly obvious to them that this should find a place in the Constitution.
And what happened? What happened on the road to 2020?
Well, I think what happened is, India in the 1960s and 70s, there was a very strong leftist or neo-communist intellectual movement that started seeing India as a collection of sub-nations or principalities. How Churchill famously described India as a geographic expression, nothing more, as much a geographic expression as the equator is, and not being a coherent entity. And we actually, even there, we have a lot of nuanced takes in the book. But basically, they wanted to say India is not one. It was a political unit created in 1947. And therefore, if somebody speaks about cultural continuity or civilizational continuity, he or she has an illegitimate political stand. So that became one political point of view, which, as Rajeev said, became mainstreamed from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And it's only now being challenged again. So what is obvious to you, and I fully agree, it is obvious, but sometimes what is obviously in front of your nose, you don't recognize.
So there was a sort of lacunae somewhere in the 60s and 70s where this went missing. I mean, do you think that was something that was happening all over the world in any case? I mean, there was a certain element around the world that history had been forgotten, that it was over in certain cases. So in that sense, do you think India is mirroring what's happening in the rest of the world, or do you see it as being a uniquely Indian thing, that forgetfulness?
No, I would say it was a more exacerbated stand by certain interest groups in India, driven by certain interest groups in India, especially after it was late 1960s, when the Congress had split. And then, the left parties in India gained control of certain key kind of universities, educational institutions, and then that narrative started percolating through.
Do you think it was intended, or do you think it's part of the law of... You do?
I think it was intended.
You think it was a deliberate attempt? For what purpose?
See, the point is, if India is not one civilization from time immemorial, then it makes easier to justify politically secession. It undermines any argument of cultural or civilizational continuity. Quite frankly, to be very honest, it makes a political attack on the Hindu dharmic identity of India much more politically palatable.
It almost sounds like a sort of form of communism, Harsh, in a way.
It was
another name.
They were Marxist intellectuals. They were Marxist intellectuals who Rajeev mentioned. They kind of took over JNU and other... JNU was created actually for them when Indira Gandhi relied on them for electoral support. And she was kind of focusing on administration, and she outsourced all kind of curriculum and ideological issues to them for a decade or two. And that's what we are now dealing with, the after effects of which in many ways. So we're actually reclaiming something that should be obvious, as you rightly mentioned.
And do you think, I mean, famously, of course, as we all know, living in India, as I do, as you do, famously, of course, we have a great demographic advantage here, given our youth. Are the ideas in here, do you think, commonplace amongst the young, millennials, Gen Z, or do you think there's a need to sort of reawaken some of that civilizational knowledge?
I think intuitively, a lot of people would sort of, these ideas would resonate with a lot of people, but often people can't place, why they think in a certain way or how they should think in a certain way with a framework. So I think what we try to do with the book is provide a framework.
It's India's rich heritage. It's the most important thing. But do you think sometimes it goes missing because frankly, in one's day-to-day life, it's a second-order consideration.
Well, I think part of that is, yes, economic. We are a poor country. We don't have time to understand, rise the Maslow's pyramid, as it were. But I think, as you said, there's a rich heritage. And if you were to graduate from a Western university till 20, 30 years ago, as you did, like Oxbridge or the Ivy League in the US, you had the great classics courses. You would study Homer, Iliad, Odyssey. In India, we have a perverted definition of secularism, under which, if you want to study the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, you're pushing Hinduism in state policy. And the problem, the way Hinduism is it's difficult to define where religion begins and where culture ends, right? It's all interlinked. So just to avoid that debate, what we did was we don't teach these epics, which are much longer than Iliad and Odyssey combined, and which really inform our day-to-day existence. We don't teach them in formal education. We learn that through our grandmothers. We see that on TV serials. And it's basically a jugaad, so to speak, about our own heritage. And that's why many of us are deracinated, and that's very unfortunate.
We use the term deracinated in the work. Let's talk a little bit about what you've just mentioned, which is the phenomenon of how the majority, according to you in the book, have in a way been marginalised. I mean, some people would struggle to understand that concept. Talk us through the idea that somehow, by an accident of history or politics, the Hindu majority has been, in your terms, disadvantaged. Because many would look at it from the outside of you and say, how can that possibly be the case that there's disadvantage? Let's talk a bit about that.
No, I'll just pick up on one thread actually in how the Hindu community is actually discriminated almost by the government. So in the control of religious institutions, so most Hindu religious temples, institutions are actually under government control. And then obviously India asserts that it is a secular country. So
whereas mosques
does that make sense? And other religions, they have autonomy, they have control of the religious places. So I think that one particular point is, I would highlight that. Harsh, would you like to add anything else?
I think more broadly than public policy, which Rajeev absolutely rightly highlights, yeah, we are definitely a majority, so-called Hindu majority within India, but you have to see in the global context. It's still a relatively poor country. The world has an Abrahamic majority. The West is very dominant. India had a strong Islamic imperialist past. And Islam and Christianity are proselytizing religions. Within the global framework, Hinduism is a bit of a minority, especially an ideological minority.
But are people concerned about that day-to-day, Harsh, in India, just pushing back on you a bit in the sense that people's horizons might be much more limited than that, and granted, the Abrahamic religions might be absolutely bigger, but...
You're right, which is why in the 60s and 70s, people could get away with that politics. As India is getting richer and there are more and more people who try to seek meaning in their identity, in their self, in the civilization. That is why there's precisely now a pushback. And there was not earlier when we were even poorer on a per capita basis.
But if we I mean, we've talked before separately about how these ideas link to the rest of the world. Is that idea about a recognition of certain aspects of Hinduism, the Hindu faith, which itself, is a non-proselytizing, open. It's an open type of religion. But would you draw a parallel with the need to protect and think about all of those? It's more than it's an institution; it's a faith. With, for example, nationalism in other countries.
Yeah, I think to some extent. I think Hinduism, because it forms, or dharma is probably a better word, forms the bedrock of Indian civilization, which you write in the book. There's similarly patriotism or nationalism for a place like the US. In Europe, nationalism has very negative connotation because of the two world wars.
Yeah.
But let's see the US. Their civic religion is their constitution. But India being much more ancient, it is civilizational while not being orthogonal to the constitution. So our civilizational identity informs our constitutional value, which in turn informs our patriotism.
Is this Trumpian?
It's not Trumpian. We are not trying to bring back some kind of discriminatory past. In the American context...
Mr. Trump would say the same. He's only being a voice for the majority white working class.
Historical context is different. There was slavery in the US. They went against the Native Americans. The white majority was the privileged majority. Whereas in India, we had British Christian colonialism. We had Turkic Muslim colonialism. The Hindus have not had their own state for 1,000 years across all of India, even if it's not united. They've had it in different parts of India. So even though that sounds a bit politically incorrect, the historical contexts are completely different. Hindus have been the underdog in a political sense.
No, and partition was a reality in 1947.
And then, of course, it's like if Canada and Mexico were part of the US and then they were partitioned based on some ideology, and that ideology was further kind of pushed down through public policy in what remained the United States, it would be a very different context to what the Trumpian context, which is nativist. They're against Mexican immigrants who are Christians, who are just slightly darker, some more melanin in the skin, and beautiful culinary diversity. Whereas in India, if you now allow illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, which was Bengal, remember, West Bengal is in the eastern part of India. It's called West Bengal because there was an eastern Bengal that's no longer part of India. And therefore, we must recognize the different realities.
So in essence, what we're trying to say is that the ideas of respecting, valuing, celebrating traditions are not incompatible with the idea of openness and a celebration more broadly. And certainly in the book, you set a lot of store by the very openness of the Hindu faith.
It depends on the tradition. And if the tradition is for openness, then it's fine. So it cannot be neutral towards tradition.
Let's pan out a little bit. I mean, our strapline is world is one. So one of the things we'd like to do is try and put this in the international context. And let's talk first of all about positive discrimination, which when, to my understanding of the book, is put down as one of the things that has, in essence, weakened modern India by creating preferences and also creating a sense of inferiority. So on the one hand, attempting to buoy up tribes, religions, but having the effect, according to you, of reducing it. But if you compare this, let's say, to minority protection rights in the United States, do you see this as being part of a much more global thing? Is what you're talking about particular to India? Tell us a bit about that.
So I think we differentiate between affirmative action on caste and religious lines. And we say caste is fine for the moment so long there is some sunset clause, because there is history of discrimination on the basis of caste. But if you have affirmative action in the name of minority religion, especially if those minority religions are proselytizing, you're de facto incentivizing conversions away from the majority Hindu community.
But does that matter?
Of course that matters. Why would any community vote and pay their own taxes to incentivize conversions away from their own selves?
What is there to worry about in the sense that if one's comfortable with the idea of all faiths, the idea that someone's converting someone...
Because the idea you convert to, that faith is not comfortable with the idea of all faiths. They might have a view that if you don't believe this, you go to hell.
And one of the chapters we have in the book, which is called Kashmir, Pakistan and Karl Popper, we make the case that Popper, obviously the famous historian of science, one of his key ideas was don't tolerate the intolerant.
Yes.
And we make the case for that through the lens of what has happened in Kashmir, and even touching upon the history of partition, that can this be or should this be permitted in an open society, and can the freedoms of an open society be used to destroy it?
And just to answer a previous question, this kind of debate is global. For example, look at what's happening in France. Right? France is this kind of laissez-faire model where strong individual rights, you're French, we don't care as a government what other identity you have. And they're struggling between liberty and laissez-faire. Should they allow face coverings in publicly funded schools, colleges and offices because it produces separatism? That's what Macron is talking about.
As per what Macron has articulated as French values, he's standing up for French values. And they are having that internal churn, internal debate in France as to where the line should be. So it's actually, I would say, it's very difficult for someone not in that world or not in that country to be able to say that this should be the line. And I don't think that globally we can draw one line.
So I think it's definitely French values are different from Turkish values, but I would go one step ahead and say French values are better than Turkish values, because Erdogan would not even recognize the Armenian genocide, which happened 100 years ago in his country, just after the Ottoman Empire crumbled. And therefore, he is speaking against India, which does not have laissez-faire. We have a very perverted definition of secularism. Going
back to the period in modern India where there was a kind of wholesale, in your terms, forgetfulness around some of this stuff.
Yes.
That coincided with a period, if you took my father's generation, if you'd said to someone then that people would fight, if you said to them in the 60s, people would fight wars of religion, people would have laughed at you.
Yeah.
But on a global level, the debate around faith, creeds, and the whole way that fits with state and society is a live one. So to that extent, what's being described in here is just part of, a
broader
global
phenomenon,
trend, isn't it?
It is the Huntington thesis in a way, right? The clash of civilizations. So modernity, prosperity in much of the world, and increasingly so even in this part of the world, has still not done away with certain questions of what the values are.
Well, that's
Those
right.
values remain.
In fact,
That's
to some
right,
extent,
isn't
it's brought it back.
Yeah, it's brought
Well, I
back.
think that's right, because again, you would have said probably at any time between the 60s and 80s that it was a dialectic between communism and capitalism, and that one would win.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one ostensibly won, but actually all that's really done is to leave people unsatisfied, and therefore, I mean, look at how many people come to India to discover their faith
Exactly.
from all over the world.
From the Beatles' time to now. So basically, when capitalism won and Soviet Union collapsed, Francis Fukuyama famously said it's the end of history and the last man. And he's obviously kind of revised his thesis a bit now. And even if it's not a clash of civilization, it's at least a recognition that we are different civilizations.
Yeah.
And there was a time when, as a hippie, you could drive from Western Europe to Afghanistan. But then the 1979 Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, and then so many other dominoes fell. And now we are in a stage where we cannot run away from this question. And either we speak about it in euphemisms, or we speak about it openly but humanely.
But do you think, Harsh and Rajiv, and one of the things you talk about in the book is the innate kind of insecurity of the Indian in the face of the world, right?
To some extent.
To some extent, and that might be overstating it, but a sense of that despite the power, wealth and history of India, in the modern age, there's been a certain latent insecurity.
Yes.
Do you think now, through books like this, through the gathering of India's strength, some of that sense of confidence that was there in the past is now returning?
People have the time on hand, actually.
I mean, just simple math, right? We have 1.4 billion people, almost $2,000 per capita income, so we are 2.8 trillion, let's say. The US is 330 million people, $60,000 plus per capita, 20 trillion.
Yeah.
So they have 4 times less the people, but they have 7 times larger economy. I mean, not adjusting for cost of living, but when you're buying military ships, etc., you don't do a PPP adjustment. It's the dollar exchange rate.
And as Rajiv said, in the Maslow theory, it's hard to philosophize when you haven't got a roof over your head.
Milton Friedman had said, for someone to advocate for freedom, in the first place, that person should be able to earn a living.
Yeah, the stomach should be full.
Absolutely. Okay, but if we take so let's talk about in India and the world. How do you see that the world sees India? I mean, that's a big question. And why do you think they see India in a certain way? Let's talk about that a bit.
Well, I think it's all over the place. I think they see it as a poor country. They see it as a spiritual country. They see it as a country on the rise.
Yeah.
They see it as a country that's democratic but messy. And of late, a lot of people are seeing the more intolerant aspects of it, which you can discuss and debate. So I think it's a large country and people have different views. And I think as tourism increases, I think more and more people will have more nuanced views of India.
But is that part of the problem, is that it's such a complex place? People make it pastiche.
Yes, very pastiche.
No, and I would also say that traditionally, post sort of independence, India would tend to be a little coy. If you look at the history of 70 years, there was a certain kind of diffidence almost.
Yeah.
You know, when a UN Security Council seat is offered, India is like, maybe we don't want it.
We've never done it. It's pretty daunting to
let's
to New
give
York
it to China, that kind of thing. And today, in the last 6 years, starting in 2020, in the last 6 years, we are seeing a more assertive India, which the world is not used to.
Well, I mean, frankly, if you take Westminster, the seat of democracy, that's been 500-600 years in the making, and we're only at the 70-year mark.
I think that's very well put, because before the 70-year mark, India was under British colonialism, and Rajiv and I would argue before that we were under Turkic colonialism.
Yeah.
So that's many centuries where you've lost the art of statecraft.
Yeah.
Whereas the Chinese civilizational entity was a civilizational state throughout. We've only got the state part now. We've been a civilization who's converting into a nation state through the agency for democracy. But the Chinese have long memories of what happened in that era. The emperor made a mistake, the emperor made a right decision there. And even somebody like Mao would kind of read those Chinese kind of classics and draw decisions out of that.
Yeah.
So we are only now kind of reconnecting with the past while being completely modern in today's age.
Well, yes, and I suppose here, if we continue the China piece, it may not be entirely homogenous, but it's more homogenous than
India.
The language is similar.
And by state writ, they are homogenizing the country further.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, but if we going back to the international side of it, so the world sees India in a certain way. You talk for modern young India, Gen Z and millennials. How do you see Gen Z and millennials seeing the world from an India perspective? What's the thought process there?
Well,
Hard to generalise.
I would say, of course, we'll have to generalize a bit, but I think there is a massive psychological difference. And we see that even in economic policy making in terms of, should we be scared, should we open? I think the younger generation is significantly more confident and aspirational than even one generation earlier. In fact, I would say every 5 years in India feels like psychologically a new generation. Because the speed of change, what happened in the West over centuries, is happening over decades in India. And sometimes when I'm talking to somebody like 10 years younger than me or Rajiv, we feel like, wow, look at the confidence.
Almost out of touch.
Just turn to finish off. Let's turn to some of your sort of personal dreams and ambitions. What's the dream? Where do you guys want to get to, Rajiv?
I see myself working in the private sector, doing what I'm doing, which is investing in private companies and public companies. I'm very, very optimistic about India's future economically. I think the next decade or two is going to be these are going to be the decades that everyone has dreamed of and hoped of for India. So I hope to sort of keep doing that, keep contributing to the public discourse through projects like the book, and make my contribution to building the new India.
That's excellent. Harsh?
Very, very similar. Professionally, I'm an investor. I'm a big India bull. I'm long India. Very excited about the coming decade. Very excited about contributing to the discourse in whatever little way I can. With my friend Rajiv, separately, however it happens. And just, we think we are at the cusp of something big here. I think the tailpiece, the postscript is India's moment in the book. And I think in many ways the pandemic has actually accelerated many trends. As horrific and painful as it has been for many families, it's accelerated many economic and technological trends that should actually bring that India moment actually further up. Instead of all the gloom and doom you read about India in pink papers abroad, we think that's actually accelerated the rise of India.
Harsh, Rajiv, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really enjoyed that and look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much,
Jasper.
Thank you.